This session is from ASF's 2024 conference at RMIT Melbourne with Kevin Donnelly, Andy Mullins, Tim Berryman, Steve Chavura and Jason Strecker.
But education is something which has been debated and discussed through the ages. Aristotle famously said, give me the boy at 7 and I'll show you the man. Later on, we actually see that, we see a lot of other people talk about it, but Abraham Lincoln, for instance, talks about it and says basically the cultural philosophy that appears in the classroom in one generation becomes the culture and philosophy in government in the next. And I think we see that certainly as being the case. Tony, before becoming Prime Minister of England, outlined his first 3 priorities: education, followed by education, followed by education. And we see Kevin Rudd in Kevin 07 in this 2007 election have at the centrepiece of his that of the education revolution. Now, so you can see how the importance has actually been through this process, and yet the IPA and others as well have seen a decline in our educational standards over the last 20 years or even more, in fact. And they say that basically that in English and science, students now are a year behind where they were comparatively in 2000. In maths, the situation's even worse, being about 1.5 years. And at the coalface, I can certainly say that is the case. And so we've got a series of challenges, and those challenges are not isolated. But yet we've got some challenges, and as Gigi mentioned, one of the things, the metrics that we have against us is the kind of society that we're going to leave to the next generation. And so what we've assembled here is an expert panel, a very experienced panel and a diverse panel, an inclusive panel in that process. Thankfully, I said that because Kevin Donnelly will be the first speaker. Now, just to give you an outline, most people know who Kevin Donnelly is, but he's an author of many books. So please have a look at that. One of the ones there which is up there, is called Wake Up to Woke. Now, one of the things that has been noticed in our education system is our inability to concentrate for a long period of time. And so that's reduced over time. So when I went through some decades before, I was speaking to the editor of a newspaper, and he said, you basically got 3 minutes, okay, and people lose concentration. Doesn't sound very much. But those metrics have dropped down to somewhere under 30 seconds now. The reason why I say that is because Kevin's a canny person, and he's written this book in that vogue. So each of the sections in it are done in such a way that you can actually digest them in a matter of a few minutes. I found it really enlightening. So if you want an overview of the kind of influences that's there, and in the education section, you can actually flick right component too. So thank you for that, Kevin. So he's been an author, but he's also, you've probably seen him in media and conducting many interviews, and he works with the Australian Catholic University for another 4 weeks. Okay, so I can say that at the moment. It's been cancelled. Well, you know, we're all going to get cancelled at some stage, aren't we? On the board of the national curriculum. Okay, Tim Berryman is on the far side here, is a principal for the Fitzroy Community School. And he's got a fascinating story to tell as well. And he's got a real heart for the way kids develop through with some quite unique things that he considers common sense, and maybe they are. Andy Mullins as well is a fellow author and has a real heart again for Christian character, also for character of students going forward. I'm looking forward to what he has to say as well. And finally, Steven Chavura is going to come up as well. He works at Campion College. You may have seen him in the media quite a lot of times, podcasts. And and he's a history lecturer at Campion College as well. Okay, but without further ado, I'm going to call up Kevin Donnelly to the stage. And I'll read out a bit of a bio and a bit of a personal note as well. So since first warning about the dangers of political correct language control and groupthink in the mid-1990s, Dr. Kevin Donnelly himself, in the words of Sky News' Peter Credlin, as one of Australia's foremost culture war warriors. In 2014, Kevin chaired the review of the Australian National Curriculum, and in 2016 was made a member of the Order of Australia for Services to Education. So if you notice on his name tag, it says AM. I actually insisted on being the first thing in the morning, which is why education is the first thing up, but anyway. Kevin is a vocal defender of Western civilization and Judeo-Christianity against the destructive nihilistic impact of neo-Marxist-inspired woke ideology. He writes regularly for the print and digital media, including The Australian, The the Catholic Weekly, Quadrant, the Australian Spectator, and the London-based Conservative Woman. That's one of the publications I haven't read yet, but I will. Kevin also appears regularly on Sky News, and books published include The Dictionary of Woke, Cancel Culture, and The Left's Long March, Christianity Matters in These Troubled Times, and How Destroying Australia. Kevin's website is kevindonnelly.com.au. But I've got to admit today, and I can say this because I've got the microphone at this point in time until Kevin gets up, is I actually have a bone to pick with Kevin. And the bone to pick is that as a family, we've had the opportunity over the last couple of years in particular to hear Kevin speak publicly on a number of occasions. Really good relationship with our family, and our kids really look up to him. And so when I came home to my family and said, you know what, I've got the privilege to actually stand up here and moderate the education section, which I'm passionate about, and Kevin Donnelly's agreed to agree on the panel, and the kids cheered. And I thought, that's fantastic. I felt really and I thought, this is great to have my family support. And then my kids corrected me and says, no, we're cheering for Kevin, not for you. So I didn't invite my kids here today, by the way. So. Kevin, without further ado, please, over to you.
One, two. So close. But no, it's fabulous to have been invited.
Yeah, switch. Beautiful.
1, 2, 1, 2. No, thank you very much for the invitation. When I received this, I had to think twice, because normally on a Saturday morning, I'm at the Victoria Market up the road here, which I do have for the last 30 years. And so I had to get up early Friday morning and go to the market, which is okay because they had, you rarely see it, some lovely blue eye and king. So we're happy at home. But no, just very quickly, I've only got 5 minutes. I went to La Trobe University during the 70s, mid-70s, and a bit like Monash, it was the home of the Cultural Revolution. Some of you old enough might remember this was a time of moratoriums, Germaine Greer. It was an incredible time in terms of, Wordsworth, I think, spoke about the French Revolution. Great was it to be alive, and I always get the quote wrong, but to be young was very heaven. During the 70s was a great time because you could do pretty well whatever you wanted, in the sense of it was a rejection against authority, whether it was the church or family or academic studies. And it was a time where conservatives do. I think it was a quote attributed to Churchill. If you're not a progressive, or if you're not left-wing by the time you're 18, you've got no heart. If you're still one when you're 28, you've got no brains. So I was pretty much involved back then in the day. Yeah, but I'm always careful now. But I taught for 18 years, secondary school, and Joan Kerner, Mother Russia, as I call her, Joan Kerner was Education Minister, and she destroyed education in Victoria as we knew it. And she gave a talk at a Fabian Society, 80s, where she said, if we're to win the socialist revolution, we must take control of schools. And she was serious, and I respect her in a way, because unlike many people today, she was honest about what she wanted to achieve, whereas a lot of the last really disguised it. But I got involved very much. I went back, did a postgrad, looking at education school education over the last 20, 30 years. And one of the things that struck me, and we talk about mathematics and science and numeracy and literacy, but I've turned more towards focusing on what I call cultural literacy. Some of you might know about E.D. Hirsch Jr. in America. And it goes way back. I mean, you can talk about Michael Oakeshott, you can talk about T.S. Eliot, you can go back to the Renaissance, to the ancient Greece and Rome, the Bible. There's a view here about the West's cultural patrimony or the West's heritage. And one thing that struck me when I was teaching and since is that has been destroyed. and universities where children, and it's no wonder they're often depressed and nihilistic and bleak, because we don't give them any optimism or hope or sense of objectivity or truth or beauty or that spiritual and transcendent sense of what is important about life. So in the book, I talk a lot about the need to focus on cultural literacy, that patrimony, that heritage, which since the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 30s, goes back to Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, people, sociology, the philosophy of sociology, I call it, Bourdieu. So the argument is Western capitalist societies only maintain control by indoctrinating people. And so what the left has done is taken the long march, to use Rudy Duce, through the institutions. And I'll finish just by saying I'm optimistic. As a Catholic, I do believe in God's grace. I'm not a good Catholic, by the way, but Bob Santa Maria always said to me, once you're one of us, you can't leave. But I do believe in the inherent goodness in people. And I know there are a lot of young people who are thirsting for a more spiritual and transcendent and knowledge-rich. It's now called knowledge-rich, which can mean anything you like. But more optimism is the last 3 years I've organised forums. Melbourne, then Campion College in Sydney, then Brisbane this year. In Brisbane we had 90 people registered who were starting up their own schools around Australia. Now whether it's Wagga or Perth or Sydney or Brisbane, schools have been there for a while, Christian schools like Toowoomba, but people are starting up their own schools because they're fed up saying enough is enough. And we'll organise another forum next year. So my webpage is kevindonnelly.com.au. If people want to email me and keep in touch, what I'll be doing is organising another forum next year. There are a lot of good people from the ground up, but there are also a lot of good business people, philanthropists, who are willing to pay for this. So let's all keep in touch, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. If only someone had written more about Joan Kerner and the Fabian Society. Page 122 in, just so happens in the Wake Up to Woke, is talking about exactly that, so the influence on the Victorian education system. Tim Berryman. Now, Tim's actually a principal at the Fitzroy Community School, where he has dedicated his professional career to creating a learning environment aimed at enabling young people. Timothy's education journey is a long and a broad one, including university studies in China, Norway and Spain. Tim has completed education and the ethics of bioengineering. In recent years, Tim has been concerned about the growing number of children receiving disability labels due to the significant ramifications of such diagnoses on children's self-concept and future prospects. The area of his doctoral study in 2020 and 2021. Tim rose to national prominence after taking a public stance against school closures due to their dire impact on many children. If you do a search for his school, you can see a link called COVID, and it actually has all of the different articles along those lines. And I think to read, dating back to March 2020, when Dan Andrews, in a Victoria context, but he actually says that school closures, the cost of closing schools is far more than the benefits involved. Interesting, isn't it, to look back in retrospect in history. So on a personal note, I had an opportunity in his school yesterday with my wife, Kelly, and it's something quite extraordinary to look in practice. But the heart he has for children and their development is something to behold. But perhaps the biggest compliment I can give him is that the Herald Sun labelled him the reckless principal. So without further ado, I hand it over to Tim.
Thank you, Jason, for that. One of the joys of running a small school is you don't have a whole bureaucratic framework above you. get to regularly ask myself, what's the purpose of schooling, and to keep workshopping that one. And so I'm going to ask that question today, really, what's the purpose of schooling? And the answer I come up with is that when we graduate these young, when they've done their 6 years or 12 years or 13 years, when they come out the other end, I'd like them to be people whose sense of agency is expanded, who have a greater sense of what they can contribute to the world. So it's a skill set, but it's also a mindset. Concept is really important. And so when I structure my school day or my school week, it's always aimed at agency. Now, the skills that we have in society, and I think, Jason talked about, the literacy and numeracy sort of falling off a cliff. That is part of school, and that's into self-concept. But it's the mindset that's really important. And if you think about the average group of kids starting school, they're like sort of wide-eyed and positive, and they've got so many stories to tell you, and they engage with you, and they turn over rocks when you take them to the park and find creepy crawlers. And they're alive. And then you get your average group of kids sort of finishing year 6, and they've got their hoods over their head, and they've got their head down. They're looking at the ground. So I think whatever we're doing, actually it's not aimed at that. The skill set and the mindset, are entwined. So, our falling standards in numeracy are really, really tragic. What I loved about the little bio on the university, when they talked about creative things, they included statistics. And I thought, that was okay, I'm going to have to process that one tonight. But that's skill. Somebody said to me at the start of lockdown, how come you're not freaking out? And I said, well, I looked at the numbers. The average person who's dying over in Italy, I didn't believe the numbers from China, but they ended up actually at start being correct. I looked at the numbers in Italy, and the average with 83 with 3 or more comorbidities. And I said, well, I'm running a primary school. It's not exactly my demographic, which doesn't mean, and somebody said to me, well, you're one of the rare people who can look at a set of numbers and make a non-panic decision or something. So I actually loved that we include statistics in that. I thought, whoever put this. And so really that's been my mission at school, to graduate people who believe in themselves. Kevin touched on before about, some sort of schools can be a very negative space, and they're not the people we want. We want people who actually believe in themselves. We're going to get onto things like what's going well in schooling and what's going badly, but that's always been my objective. And the skills will be different. Like, for the school, if I was talking about this in Tokyo, well, one of the literacy component would be Japanese. And if we shift it to medieval Japan, it's going to probably have to include swordcraft of some description. Skills will be different, but the actual self-concept, I don't think that's really changed. Anyway, thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Tim. And just to one-up Kevin Donnelly, Tim's biography, or the story of the school, is actually thicker than his book. So, look, unfortunately, he's given me a temptation I can't stop. He's talked about statistics. So along those lines, in terms of statistics and the creativity, I'm going to ask everyone a maths question which was presented, and I think it was a really horrible thing that was actually presented. We teach graphs in school, right? And we teach what's called a cumulative graph. And our cumulative graph actually accumulates. It keeps going up. But it was one of the graphs in 2020 that was trying to freak people out by dying, because it kept going up, right? It's going up, and our health experts are going, we've got to get this graph down, and it keeps going up. So I present the question to students, how is it that graph is, circumstances will have to occur for that to come down? And they think about it for a fair bit, and if you're thinking about it yourself, the only way that graph can come down is if those dead people come back to life. And to my memory, I can only think of one person that that's happened to, so it's not going to happen particularly frequently. But yes, the creativity in statistics is exactly right. The data itself and how you present it is important. The next person we've got up is Andy Mullins. Now, to give you an idea about the one-upmanship that's going on, he's gone, I've got a couple of books that I would like you to look at. I haven't got quite the thickness of Kevin Donnelly's or whatever at the time, so we're going to go a couple of them. So please consider looking at them, as we are too. and learning from them. Now, Andy Mullins teaches Formation of Character course at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney and runs a small university project in Carlton in Victoria. From 1996 to 2014, he was Headmaster at Redfield College and Wollemi College in Warrington. He is author of Parenting for Faith and a newly released discussion workbook for parents. Parenting for Character Applied. His doctorate investigation is in the neurobiology of virtue, which would be a good discussion point at a time. I would like to thank Andy actually for the work he's actually done in this space, because there's two things that are dear to my heart. One is childhood character development. Sometimes that's called resilience and a whole series of other things too, but really it's childhood character development. But the other one, which we don't talk about enough, is the relationship with parents. Okay. You know, as a teacher, we only have those kids in our care, and I love the kids I teach, but they're not my children. Okay, so that relationship with parents is so important. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Andy. Hopefully his microphone works.
Thank you. We're good? Yeah, thanks for the invitation too, Jason and Nick. Thank you. Basically throw two things at you. It was about the parents and how can we practically support parents in what they're doing. So for example, last night in Melton, in the far west of Melbourne, I spoke to a group of 70 parents who want to start a school in Melton. It's impressive, right? That's my background. I started off in the government system, and then 7 years in, Redfield College started in Sydney, and I went across as a half a teacher because they started with 2.5 teachers. And then eventually I ended up running the school, and those schools in Sydney now are something like, there's like 2,000 students involved. The second side of this is the character, and I thought I'd pick up on the name of your organisation, Science and Freedom. And freedom is deeply related to character. And I'll come to that. Have you heard of a lady called Elizabeth Anscombe? Anscombe is a groundbreaking philosopher in the 20th century. She's really the person responsible for putting character back on the map, indirectly because she relaunched virtues as a discussion point, if you like. And she said, we've got to stop telling people how they should act until we get our psychology right, until we know what a human being is, until we know what fulfills a human being. How can we talk about what people should do? And yet all the time we're telling kids what they should do and how they should act and how they'll be fulfilled, and we don't even know what a human being is often when we have that discussion. I suppose I've been very involved in character, and the schools that I've been involved in have certainly led me in that direction. And I keep coming back to the building blocks of character, virtues, good habits. And of course that comes from Aristotle, but it got profoundly Christianized by Augustine. Just to go into this for 1 second, if you ask an ancient Greek scholar, why should I have self-control? Why should I be courageous? They would say, it's the noble thing to do. And that's it. There's no other justification, essentially. It's justified in its own space. You ask St. Augustine that question, and he said, virtues enable you to love. So there's a really profound fulfillment of what Aristotle sent us, this path that he set us on, that human beings are relational. They're not fulfilled in themselves in isolation. So ancient classics had to come up with Plutarch's definition of what it is to grow up. Plutarch said, we grow up when there's a change of master and we become our own masters. But it's all about self and autonomy, if you like. And I think we can go better than that in our society, because beings are relational and we're fulfilled in relationships of love. And if we don't understand that, then we don't understand that justice and charity are absolutely fundamental in every choice we make. We've forgotten that. Last point, have I got one? Have I got another 30 seconds? We had a session in the small for university students, and we had a speaker the other night on utilitarianism, and it was a critique of it. And as you probably know, there are 3 main sort of paradigms of how human beings should behave: utilitarianism, rule-based ethics, and virtue ethics. And it was like a light bulb going off. on. Right from Aristotle, we know human beings always act for an end. We're always, in a sense, utilitarian. But what we measure our utilitarianism against is always our conscience. Utilitarianism as such, and we're immersed in it in our society, and a lot of God that we're here, that brings us here, if you like. Utilitarianism is a sleight of hand that removes conscience from the decision making. And conscience is prudence. It's one of the virtues.
Thanks very much, Andy. Please take the opportunity to talk to Andy about any of those things, because they're actually quite profound concepts with regards to ourselves, but certainly in our generations that are coming through. Steven Chavura is the next one that's going to speak today, and I'm sorry, Steven, I actually could not fit in his book, The Forgotten Menzies. It was actually too heavy for me, just to outdo everyone else. It's kind of like a tome to read, but please consider looking that up and buying that to actually learn more about what the start of what Menzies was actually referring to in the context of what we're doing. Oh no, I sound like Kamala Harris. Oh, thank you. Excellent. Very gracious. I'm not sure how to take that. Steven Chavura is a senior lecturer in history at Campion College, Sydney. He is author and co-author of 3 books and regularly contributes to the public debate in print and podcasts. Dr. Chavura has been a vocal defender of religious freedom and freedom of speech over the past 5 years. He was also a vocal opponent of the draconian vaccine mandates during the COVID panic and lamented seeing Australia descend to a manufactured hysteria not seen since World War. Just on a personal note, some personal research that I did on Steven as well, I found out that he's actually been labelled the handsomest man to be on the Bolt Report, according to social media. But don't let his masculine physique fool you, because he's got a heart for kids, for young men and young women growing up. So much so that my wife and I and our family have got to see him in action in a couple of public forums, but we actually couldn't get close to him. He was like the rock star of academics. He's been surrounded by young people all the time, which I thought was actually pretty cool. In fact, so much so that ARC conference, I got a text from someone there saying the highlight of the ARC conference was the ability to spend some time with Steven. Take that, Jordan Peterson. Steven, over to you.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I always, when I hear things like this, I always think, where was all this popularity back then? This is the thing. Okay, you can, we're okay here? Okay, look, this is a very brief talk, and it's called Against Critical Thinking. So maybe I'll get some pushback here. So the universal mantra of universities these days, when sort of asked, what do you come here to do at university? What are you going to teach students? The answer is always the same. We're going to teach you how to think critically. We're not going to teach you what to think. We're going to teach you how to think. That's certainly what I heard, and I think it's more or less what we've been hearing for probably 30, 40 years at least. I guess I'm calling for something of a paradigm shift, particularly among those who are starting new institutions. And I guess if there's an upshot to my talk, it's something like, if you're going to start new institutions because you're unhappy with the old institutions, don't think twice before you start a trick as well. There might actually be a better way to conceptualize what we're doing for our students. How can we critique the world if we know little to nothing about the world? In other words, critical thinking, whatever that is, can really only take place off the back of a lot of constructive and key truthful thinking. You have to know stuff in order to be able to think critically. No institution just teaches students to think critically. No institution just teaches students how to think. They all teach students what to think. I mean, it'd be a pretty strange ancient history lesson that I would give to my students if I didn't teach them the actual events about the Greco-Persian Wars. And I just sort of tried to teach them how to think about it. When you think about that, that doesn't even make a whole lot of sense. and I would actually say that the idea we don't teach people what to think, we teach people how to think. I think when you really interrogate it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It sounds good, but in actual think, I think all education certainly involves teaching a lot of what to think. I'll sort of pick up on this a little bit later. And there's nothing wrong with teaching people what to think. Critical thinking and teaching, when universities say that we teach to think critically and not what to think and how to think, I think that's one of the biggest cons that the universities pull over people. And I propose a shift in our language away from thinking critically as sort of the raison d'etre of education and universities to thinking virtually. And this is one of those sort of nice providential moments where what I'm saying ties in very nicely with Andy's talk just then. And we didn't collude at all with one another. And the thing is, in universities, when they talk about critical thinking, they're really talking about critical two very different things, the kind of cultural Marxism that Kevin has written so much about over the years. So I propose that shift from thinking critically to thinking virtuously. Now, what does it mean to think virtuously? Well, really just sort of off the top of my head, these are just a few things I would say. One intellectual virtue is humility. You know, you don't know everything. In fact, there is a ton of stuff you don't know. And there's always going to be people much smarter than you. So the number one intellectual virtue for anyone is humility. We stand on the shoulders of... we want another aspect of thinking virtuously is to think constructively, to be able to say things that are positive, and I don't mean positive in the feel-good sense of way, but to actually describe how the world really is. To just sort of criticizing everything and trying to unpack all the different ways in which there are all sorts of different modes of oppression going on. So to actually be able to think constructively. Someone once asked a very good question. It was, how many university graduates in Australia 10 or 20 years after graduation, with all that they learned, all that they read, would be competent to say, write a constitution for a country? And the answer would be a sort of a minuscule amount. And if you want a humbling experience, check out the Federation debates of the 1890s. It's incredible that the minds who were writing the Constitution to create this country. Thinking consistently, and finally, thinking truly. Thinking truly. And if you'd ask me, what the point of virtuous thinking is, it is to love and encounter the truth. Now, someone might say well, we can still use the expression critical thinking as sort of the reason for why we do what we do at universities, and we'll just do what you've sort of said, Chavura. I guess what I'm going to say now is the term itself is very unhelpful. By the way, I'm not saying that we don't actually learn critical thinking, and I'll come to that in a second, but the term is misleading and incomplete because you're not just doing critical thinking at university, you're not just learning how to think, you are being taught certain things about what to think, and again I said there's nothing wrong with that as long as what you're being taught is good and true. Also, when you have a bunch of 18-year-olds in a classroom who know next to nothing, and you say, right, I'm going to teach you to think critically, I think it actually generates more hubris than it does humility. I mean, we're really going to give these youngsters Plato and say, right, stand up and tell me what's wrong with him. I mean, what a horribly hubristic thing to do, and also what a burden to place on the shoulders of young people to have to stand in judgment over the great thinkers of the ages. And I think, the expression thinking critically as sort of the raison d'etre of education, it excessive skepticism and even relativism, where the goal of finding the truth can actually be hindered. When someone starts to think, oh, this seems really true, they sort of pull back and think, oh, no. If I say something's true, I'm being a dogmatic and I'm not thinking critically anymore. So it can actually hinder some very, very important things. should be obtaining. So in that sense, I think defining the end of universities as thinking critically can be very counterproductive, and so I would sort of not use that. The goal of truth or virtuous thinking, if pursued, will create genuinely critical thinkers. The goal of critical thinking is not to create or to generate virtuous truth-seeking thinkers. And if experience is anything to go by, it's also unlikely to generate many critical thinkers either. New institutions, this is my last word to new institutions. My suggestion, don't thinking critically mantra of the old institutions. My suggestion is to say what we do here is teach people to think virtuously or to think truly. If you don't like that, then feel free to find a better one, but just think twice before you just adopt all the rhetoric of the old institution. Such a bad job over the last 20, 30 years. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Stephen. Yeah, so in terms of a school context as well as a university, the critical thinking is a big aspect of it. And Stephen's quite right. It is something which is considered the apex of learning to a lot of extent, but that comment you made about hubris is exactly right. We don't actually develop the foundations to enable students to create, to critically think. And so, I can't remember if it's Chesterton that basically says we create open-tested people, and really what that does is leave them vulnerable to whatever decision making comes up in the future. So it sounds great, it's a great marketing term, but yeah, no, thank you for that. So the next section we've got is basically question and answer from the panels themselves. And I'd like you guys as an audience as well to think about some of the questions and make a note of any questions that you might have as well, because there'll be a section where you will get the opportunity to then ask questions of the panellists. Hopefully, the microphones are supposed to be all working now, so who has a microphone next to them? This is like a ring a rosy or something like that. Okay, excellent. With Tim with the first question, but if I don't mention your name, obviously just jump in at any stage because it's not exclusive, but I know there's some specific points that I would like to draw out. And the first one, and this is a question for the audience as well to think about, is what are your thoughts on the importance and the purpose of education? So what do you think is the importance and the purpose of education?
Well, I already sort of covered part of that before in my intro. I'll expand on a sort of parallel theme. Apart from agency, I'd say the other thing people ask me, what are you trying to achieve with your students? And goodness is it's not an easy target in a school. Like, I think the example you said as a staff plays a big part. When I think about, all the different trials you have in your life, there are moments where you actually meet someone, you say, actually, they're a nasty person. Or they're really mean. And they do happen, but it's actually a very rare moment. But if I think back of all of my trials over many years, and there have been many, it's people knew what the right thing to do was. And I'm talking about, in the sort of, the last 4 years, it's all been to do with the education bureaucrats. I actually think everybody higher up knew that closing schools was a bad idea. I think that was a complete universal. But why did I'm still copying flack for that. Why did that happen? And I don't think they were bad people. Actually doing the right thing required standing against the crowd, standing against the thing. And so what's the key ingredient then in doing the right thing? And I'd say it's courage. Because you can ask most little kids, why did you do the wrong thing or why are you doing the right thing? And it's almost never a question of. And so actually that's really coming to that realisation as a school principal. That's actually really exciting and really positive, because then you can say, all right, how do we work on courage? Which is much easier. You can attack that much more directly than goodness. And so we do lots of projects. And I was, 2 weeks ago, I was in the Grampians taking a group of 8 to 12-year-olds on 5 different, quite long, the longest walk we did was 13 Ks. And one of the I've been doing this particular camp for years now. One of the absolute joys is actually seeing these kids long walk saying, man, I never knew I had that in me. And I get such lovely feedback from parents saying, you know, my daughter or my son came home and said, that was really tiring and it was really exhausting, but I got to the end. So I'm a bigger person, I'm a stronger person. I've grown in my concept. And so when I think about, you know, really the purpose of education, I really would like all of us to be good people. And I tackle that with courage. For some people, it's singing or dancing in front of a whole group. For, you know, we mix things up a lot at school. So I might say to a couple of 9-year-olds, oh, look after these little kids who've just started school. So we mix that up. We give lots of opportunities for the bigger kids and even sometimes the not so big kids to experience running something for themselves. And sometimes it won't work and sometimes it will work better the second or the third time. Or, you know, those camps, you know, a couple of kids at the end say, my legs turned to jelly, but they still got through it. And so I'd say aiming at goodness is mostly achieved through boosting courage in different ways.
Yeah, just quickly, I co-chaired the review of the national curriculum, and it became obvious to me, and when I did the Masters and the doctorate, I really looked at curriculum around the world in terms of, and across time. Looking at the question, well, what is the purpose of education? I mean, we spend billions of dollars. We make it, we legislate, we have innovations every second year. The new minister will have a new pet theory about how to improve things. But when I looked at the national curriculum, there was never any justification or rationale as to why you do it. What is the purpose? I looked at curriculum development in Australia over the last 40, 50 years, going back to the CDC in Canberra many years ago, to the Keating government's national statements and profiles, and up to the more recent Gillard national curriculum. And when I boiled it down, it was obvious to me that you could identify a number of answers to that question. One is competencies and skills. So you need to teach critical thinking, you need to teach kids to be creative, you need to get them to work in teams, you need them to accept diversity and difference. So it's all about these competencies. The other is what I call a child-centred education, which goes back many, many years. And it's all about choice and voice. And I hate to use the word self-agency, but the way it's interpreted, especially primary school, is the teacher becomes a facilitator, a guides by the side. Children are knowledge navigators, digital natives. So this child-centred view, where you give them an iPad, sit them on the floor with 5 other kids, and they do a group project, and only one of them ever does the work, but all of them get graded on that one person. Another is cultural Marxist, the idea of this socialist idea that goes back to the Frankfurt School and also the sociology movement, and it's been incredibly influential the last 10, 20 years around the world, the Anglosphere, as it were, and Europe. Not in China, not in Russia. They have a better idea of what they want to achieve than we ever do. And the one I enculturation, and I talk about this patrimony, this cultural heritage, and Michael Oakeshott, some of you would know, talks in The Conversations of Mankind about the conversation. And I am elitist in the sense that I don't believe you read is good. I don't believe everyone you listen to is worthwhile. I believe there are some things that are touchstones, that are enduring, that have something lasting and profound to say about human nature. Very simple questions that Archbishop Fisher talks about. Why are we here? Where did we come from? How do we find fulfillment and happiness? Where are we going? So this narrative that Oakeshott talks about is about this cultural patrimony. And in the latest book I've edited, talks defend the West, the culture of freedom. And Paul Morrissey has written a very good chapter tracing this back to ancient Greece and Rome. And Anna Crone, some of you might know, has written a very good chapter where she refers to Solzhenitsyn and his argument. And it goes right back to people like T.S. Eliot and others and Oakeshott and the Greeks. A culture that forgets its memory is in strife, is in serious trouble. And what the cultural left does is to eradicate or cancel that. And I taught literature for many years. George Orwell, 1984, was one of the favourites. And after a couple of weeks, the kids began to realise the ministry of truth had nothing to do with truth, and that to say ignorance is strength is absurd. But what totalitarian regimes do, what dictators do, what Chairman Dan did in Victoria was to use that. And the worst example, and it scared me, frightened me, because my daughter and her husband lost their jobs as teachers and weren't because they didn't want to get vaxxed. Daniel Andrews said, staying apart, you know the rest, keeps us together, which is straight out of George Orwell. So I come back to enculturation and the idea of beauty and truth. One of the things that, again, I gave up teaching in the end, secondary school. I taught year 11 and 12. I love literature. I still read every night. I love literature. It's God's gift in many ways. But so many young people now, when they read Dostoevsky or Patrick White or poetry, Keats, Yeats, they're taught to deconstruct it and critique it in terms of power. And if you've read Foucault, you understand, and Roger Scruton makes this point, that we now have a culture of repudiation, pulled apart and destroyed. And that's why I argue, if you look at the statistics, we have among young people the highest rates of anxiety, depression and self-harm. So I'll leave on that positive note.
On to then, thank you for that. It's actually worthwhile having a session on I guess that impact itself that Kevin's just spoken about between Kevin and Tim, because it shows you the cleverness and the nuanced nature of what's taking place in the education system and curriculum. Because the child centre component that's talked about is actually exactly as Kevin has outlined, but there is also positives in what can be done if you use the words correctly. So one of the things that, for instance, is students actually do get a choice on activities, but they've actually also have a set of things at a very high technical level to complete beforehand, whether it's mathematics or whether it's spelling or other things. But the purist will say that has none of that. And so you can see there's a nuanced nature often with these different concepts, which I think is actually really important to say. We've spoken about woke, and Kevin's outlined that a fair bit. I'm wondering if, with regards to that, Tim, can I put you on the spot to actually give a more nuanced, an open? The reason why I say this is because Tim actually works at an inner city school. Now, inner city, for those that are unaware in terms of the politics, tends to be left and green learning, and so they're very familiar and as a touch point with these words like woke. And so if you say that word woke, well, what happens next?
Well, no, I'm not even going to say it. It's one of I find it's really divisive. You know, it splits people into camps. When I saw it on the potential list of questions, I actually emailed Jason and said, "Do we really want to do this?" Because why back is because actually I said then we just paid ourselves a particular camp. You know, I am one of the very rare people who gets to invited to something that's a really conservative thing and then something hosted by the Greens, and I actually think that's really healthy. It's like Gigi said about having conversations with people who from a different position. So I just wouldn't use that one. When my parents started the school in our house, a word that my father used, which probably had a slight negative connotation at the time, he used it in a very positive way. He used the word trendies. And he used the word trendies, which is, we're going back now decades. They were the people willing to have a go at something and a new way of thinking and a try at something new. So without that concept, which is not quite the same as woke, but it has a few connections, actually we can't push society forward. And so I wouldn't use that. I always address the issue, okay, our speech is being controlled, rather than painting someone with a big brush. Anyway, Jason, that's probably enough on that topic. It's definitely not my favourite topic.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And I think that provides context. And I'll say this from a person who lives in one of the safest, not Greens, but Labor seats. And for the first time over the last 12 months, I got labelled as a cooker. And I didn't actually know what a cooker was. I didn't know that this person knew how good I actually cooked, or my prowess. I'm certainly no chef, but I can cook basic things good. So, but needless to say, they didn't accept my invitation for dinner, so I don't together. Stephen, can I ask you? I still don't know to this day. Conspiracy. Oh, there we go. I don't know how those things relate. I reckon it's more in depth. Anyway, yeah, thank you. Stephen, in your experience, what's the biggest lie that kids are told?
That feeling is as good as thinking. And what I mean by that is, if you just listen to the language and the vocabulary of anyone sort of under the age of 30, I shouldn't say anyone, but I started to notice years ago when I was teaching at Macquarie Uni that youngsters and you know, older people are now doing it, as the ancient historian said, a Roman, I forget his name, but times change and we change with them. But people no longer say, I think this, oh, I suspect this is the case. It's always now, what do the youngsters say now? I feel. You know, I feel that, and then they'll sort of say some sort of propositional truth. Well, you know, I can feel cold, I can feel warm, I can feel bored. I can't feel that if the Greeks had lost the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, then possibly we'd all be speaking Persian now. That's something I might suspect, something I might think, but I'm not feeling it. And the point I want to make is that there's a radical subjectivity that has entered our culture, particularly since the 1960s. And in many ways, the 1960s is the decade to study. The 60s and the 70s, they're the decades to study, to figure out so much of what is going on now. We were speaking about woke earlier. What is woke? Woke is the critical theory that emerged in the 60s and 70s that Kevin writes a lot about. It's not new one little bit. Now, so the biggest lie, I mean, there are many lies that, you know, we tell them ourselves, you know, but that if you feel something, then that's as good as having evidence. And that if someone feels something, woe betide you for saying something that might undermine their feeling or generate a negative feeling. So that is what I would say. And I try to get into the habit with my students when they say, I feel that, I will often say, you mean you think that? And they're taken aback at first. And I try to be nice to them after that because, you know, they're very fragile.
Steve,
yeah.
Steve, may I put something on top of that?
Yeah.
Just looking at the way virtue is constructed. Obviously, you know, right from Aristotle, we talk about refined feelings. That's what drives that's in our actions. So it's a matter of helping young people develop refined feelings. And I think one very useful idea there is that we need to develop an emotional life which is at the service of others, not a self-indulgent emotional life. This is quite picking up the literature theme. Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice says, I have always been a selfish person in practice, but not in principle. And there's a danger that we can fall into that and that we don't, to me, you know, you ask the question, biggest issue in education. I think the biggest issue in education is that we're not raising kids to love others. We're raising kids for self-fulfillment or self-oriented goals or whatever, right? But well, I mean, that's a good thing, but...
And let me just say, the most insidious the language of feelings is, if I feel something, what does it mean to debate feelings? What does it mean to say your feeling is wrong? Feelings, kind of like a taste for ice cream flavours, really can't be disputed. And so when we're thinking to feelings, debate becomes impossible, because how dare you question my feelings? I have a right to feel what I want. And there's certainly no path to truth when we do that. So that's the really dangerous thing about the distinction we made between feeling and thinking. It makes debate impossible.
I've got to jump in on a couple. One of the things that has, I don't know, made my head hurt recently is talking to, I'm in a different space, I'm in a primary school, talking about choices and good choices and bad choices. A couple of examples, and it's a false language of choice that actually hides a really authoritarian education system. So I don't know if you know Fed Square over here. The back of Fed Square, there's a great park, and it's got a really amazing grass slope. Anyone familiar with this? It's like 100 metres of smooth. We had an outing there not so long ago, and there's art players right next to this. Anyway, at lunchtime we went out there, and our kids just thought this was just the best place to roll down the hill. And there was another school, and I never like to name the other school, and these group of kids, and it looked like they were, a couple of them started to roll down this hill, a couple of little boys, and they got fully scolded about choices, and you've got to make good choices. And I'm like, I reckon that's a great choice for a little boy. And I was in the Grampians, I mentioned 2 weeks ago. Has anyone been to Venus Baths in the Grampians? No. So it's this that sort of a creek flows through, and it's quite smooth, and there's pools of water that are mostly sort of from knee deep down. It was a nice sunny day, and the kids from my school didn't even ask. They just sort of took their shoes off and all jumped in. And then another school turns up, and it's this day in this idyllic spot, and they're all getting scolded for bad choices about getting their feet in the water. No, I used to roll down slopes. It makes me too dizzy nowadays. But I was thinking, what are we saying to these kids? Like, there's something wrong with them for just experiencing.
I could go on a lot. So when I guess grew up through school, we talk about the experiences. We one of the first schools, I think, in the country that had surf lifesaving and surfing as part of school sport. But to get to the beach itself for surf lifesaving, we would have to hop and ride down the road to get to the swimming pool, to swim a kilometre, then ride to the surf, and then get out in the surf and do things. I struggle now to be able to get students to walk through a river or a stream with water that goes up to their knees without having appropriately qualified people. And so, that amount of over procedure and prescription and I guess justification for things and expertise, because we have to get an expert surf lifesaver to be with these kids to go through a river up to their knees, is an example, I think, of that.
And what are we teaching the children? That they can't do anything? Authority to give them permission for everything, and that's the subtext which I find really disturbing.
Yeah, and as a follow-on from that, Tim, in particular as a principal, but I'm happy for anyone else to jump in too, what's the biggest lie that parents are told?
Well, you and I have had it's always funny when you've had a proper couple of hour chat the day before. I think we really, really struggle with competency. So I'm going to share a different story, that we think our children are so incompetent academically, socially, organisationally. I mean, one of the things one of the most common ones is about just chores, like 8-year-olds wiping the table, packing the dishwasher. So many children don't do anything this, or like literally walking down the street to go to the supermarket or the milk bar to buy bread or butter or rice or whatever you're short. There's nowadays in primary school, that's actually, it's quite a rare thing. And so that one, and it's not that parents actually, the parents I have in my school, I would say you could not have a group of people that are trying to raise better children. But they're immersed in this culture of dependency and you know, sort of complete inability to self. And that's really tough on them. So I'm constantly saying, your kids can do a bit more. You can actually expect more of them.
In Sydney, we used to have the Year 2 parents get them together every year and talk about how much they expected their kids. And there's no benchmark, but, you know, the disparity was crazy. And then one mum piped up, well, in my place, mum doesn't do anything that anybody else can do. Everybody sort of nodded. And then somebody else, and then another mum said, yeah, and if they don't know, you teach them. And then a third person said, if he's old enough to walk, he's old enough to vacuum.
I'm gonna just give a little anecdote to top Andy. So years ago, I was travelling in. Actually, got two stories in Asia, just really on this competency thing. And I was in Islamabad in Pakistan, and I walked out of the train station and got into like a little motorbike taxi. Driver, and I thought, and we took off and we had a bit of a chat. And then I said, "How old are you?" And he said, 12. But another one, it's like this one is from Yunnan province in China. And I was staying in this guest house afternoon. The little girl who was about 8 turned up. And I said to her parents, where does she come from? And they said, oh, this place. And I'd walked that myself like the day before. It was like a 2.5 hour walk on a little country path. And that's her access to schooling required her to go down there on a Monday, sleep 4 days and come back. And so we sort of forgotten that actually these kids can do so many things.
Yeah, that's true. Just before we come to some audience questions, I have some thoughts about what you might want to do, and Nick's going to come around with the microphone in a moment. Stephen, I thought I'd try and put you on the spot for a moment. And the reason why I say that is because I think one of the novel contributions Stephen has had over the last few years, in my opinion, is, and from a historical sense, is the connection with World War I and the propaganda which took place then. And the reason why I say that is because it kind of opened my eyes to the fact that what we'd seen over the last few years has happened before. It's not the first time in history that it's... and it did permeate through the educational institutions and schools as well. So I was wondering if you could outline that in a minute. I'll give you 30 seconds, and then also talk about then the role that education institutions played then and what we might be able to do as educational institutions to improve the situation.
The point I made during 2020, 2021 was a lot of people would use language like this is World War II again, this is the Nazis again in terms of what was happening in Australia, the mandates and the lockdowns, and I was always very... I was always uneasy with that. I just never thought the World War II example was a great one. Then it occurred to me, I was teaching World War I at the time. You had hundreds of thousands of people rushing to enlist in a war they knew next to nothing about. And this is in no way meant to disparage the diggers, and I really don't want to do that. But rushing to join a war they knew nothing about, anyone who questioned this war was and a traitor, often thrown into prison. The Prime Minister at the time, Billy Hughes, used the hysteria to pass the War Precautions Act, which allowed him to censor information. Anything coming from the war that would slow down the rate of people signing up to fight, he had the right to censor. So keep people signing up to this. I mean, there are a whole bunch of other things, and there was just mass emotionally manipulative propaganda. Now, we all look back at World War I now and say, we certainly praise the diggers, but we also kind of say, wow, we kind of lost there as well. Like, we find it hard to believe that happened. And so, so that's the kind of thing that I saw unfold in COVID. The analogies, to my way of thinking, are actually quite powerful. And what we saw in both instances was that the universities, for the most part, were highly conformist. And what I will just say, that intellectuals are some of the most conformist people on the planet. They are highly conformist, and there are a couple of reasons for that. A fate worse than death for an intellectual is to be considered silly or unintellectual by his or her peers. That's a kind of professional social death. Sort of the nature of an expert class is that it kind of has to agree with one another. Otherwise, it kind of loses an aura of being an expert class. Experts kind of have to agree with one another, because if they don't agree, well, someone's got to be wrong. Maybe a lot of them are wrong. And so among those who deem themselves experts, there actually is quite a powerful impulse to agree with one another. And so what you do is you start gerrymandering the concept of an expert to exclude anyone who disagrees with that narrative. You say, oh, well, Robert Malone, no, I'm talking about real Robert Malone, because an expert also includes people who accept this particular point of view. And that's what intellectuals are very good at. And again, I don't know there's any way to really break that other than to have institutions where people with alternative voices can actually speak out and
Just quickly, George Orwell, some of you would know the quote that some ideas are so stupid, basically, only academics would believe in it.
I resemble that one.
Yes. Nick is going to take the microphone around. So from the floor, if you could put your hand up, please, that would be great, and he'll bring it around.
Just while I go there, if you get lost in the building at any point today, there's a lot of educational philosophy tied up in this building. There was a lot of debate about what kinds of rooms we want in this building. There was a lobby that wanted all polished, because there is nobody who can convey any kind of knowledge to others. So we don't have a single focal point. Classrooms like this are called lectorials. If you walk around, there's a couple of other tutorial rooms. There will be a computer in the corner. Try teaching there, where there is no front, there is nothing, because it's very student-centered. So if you get front, there's a lot of philosophy tied up in the architecture of the building. So anyway, just an aside.
Thank you. Steven, just picking up your point about thinking and feeling, I think when a child says, I feel, all they're doing is deferring to someone else's thinking. And that's the bit that worries me. That's how I think groupthink occurs. You're really deferring to the dominant feelings or the dominant thinking. And to go to Tim's point of standing against the dominant thinking. So I think that's all. The feelings bit is really a deferral, afraid to buck dominant thinking. Your reflections on that?
Oh, well, no, I mean, I'll take that as a comment. I think there's a lot of truth in that. The one thing I would just say is it probably also kind of supervenes on a general culture where we discourage people from making truth claims as well. And so they kind of want to say, maybe some of them want to say, I think this is the case, but they think, oh, I can't do that, because then I'd sound dogmatic, I'd sound intolerant, so I'll just the subjective language of feeling. So that would be the only thing I would add to that. I think you make a great point, and let me say, if you want a fantastic book that bucks the current trend, it's The Burden of Culture by Gary Johns here. It's one of the best books written on modern Indigenous issues that you can find, The Burden of Culture by Gary Johns, if you want to understand what's to buy.
Matthew, is it? Yeah.
So we often hear people say that the education system's not working, maths, we're not doing so well in maths and science. Now, I want to support that. I think maths and science are important, but when I see people's marriages break down, working in the workplace, or siblings not getting along, very rarely have I thought, gee, if they'd only had a bit better maths or English, that wouldn't have happened. And just to come to this idea of goodness, isn't underpinning that self-awareness and being open to all ideas? And often people say, I've got a bit of a theory that we must listen and consider all ideas, otherwise how do we know our current idea is the best idea? So I guess there's just two things I wanted to ask is, why do we keep hearing the experts say, maths and English, that's our problem? Now I do affirm that self-awareness can come through maths and English, when perhaps it's self-awareness, relational skills, that seems to be where we're not doing as well perhaps.
Just quickly again, I'm a bit wary, and I know we could have a whole session on it, about what is student agency, what is choice what is self-awareness, I'd actually argue that a young person can't have any self-awareness, truly, unless they're knowledgeable, unless they've experienced life, and you talk about literature. The reason I taught literature and loved it was because you're actually giving young people, opening a whole world of moral obligation, of responsibility, of treating others properly, of what constitutes something of aesthetic value, true, what is good. I mean, D.H. Lawrence talks about literature opening up this circumambient world to the student. I said before I'm elitist. What I mean is I don't believe an 8-year-old, even a 16-year-old, really awareness as I would like to define it, unless they have something to ground it on. And I talked about a spiritual or transcendent sense of life. And if you believe, I suppose, that we've all been made in the image of. We have to be very careful when we talk about self-awareness, because if there is a greater good, a greater sense of the absolute, of what is truth and what is beauty, you can be as self-aware of. I mean, Chairman Dan was very self-aware. You only had to see the conceit and the arrogance and the fact that he was 100% self-aware, but it's not the kind of self-awareness I like.
I'm going to jump in on that answer, and I'm going to leave the self-awareness aside. Most of the work that I do with my staff, do a proper parent-teacher. It's all what Andy would call parenting for character. It's actually all about how you're perceived and how you connect. So it's the old-fashioned expression would be about discipline. How you discipline the children. Is the expression every action or statement either brings people to you or pushes people away. And the modern jargon is all about happiness now. If you're pushing people away, you're not going to be happy. So ultimately, however you frame it, it's the same. It's is your behaviour people or not? And so really about your marriage breakdown. That's almost all we do. I actually say to the staff at the start of the year, I say, if there's a social issue that needs to be addressed, I don't care about the science class or the history class or the geography class or sports class. If that needs to be addressed as a class, that's fine. If it needs or with a couple, actually, let's organise it, and they'll send the kids to someone else so that actually that can be addressed there and then. Because really, that's my focus, is actually having people who have a good connection with others.
Just one. I talked about the three sort of paradigms, how we behave. I think we see the problem with the rule-based ethics where, who's making the rules? We see the problem with consequentialism because obviously conscience has to guide you. But virtue ethics is all about you have to be good to do good. And I here where we're cranky with, misuse of authority or whatever, and authority operates through laws and rules, I think it's quite good for us to keep coming back to the idea that I'm not just going to substitute somebody's rules by another set of rules. I have to promote goodness within, and that means really refined self-management of one's own emotional life and appetites, that I put other people first, and that I have a really well-formed conscience. Then we can contribute to the world. Otherwise, we just end up creating an alternative.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Andy. But if I read Tim right, basically what you're saying is you've just quoted Newton's laws, which is mathematics, so the relationships does actually come back to the mathematics. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay. Graham. Thanks.
Yeah, firstly, I want to thank you all for this morning. It's been really, really enlightening. At age 71, in the last 3 years, I've realised that character development is the work of a lifetime. We start and we finish when we go to the grave. The one thing I've realised, and I've had a fairly broad experience in the last 20 years, flying for Qantas, I was, my wife and I have had a very strong service orientation where we've been doing marriage rejuvenation for couples. We've written a 12-step recovery program to help addicts and people who've survived childhood sexual abuse to get their lives back. But especially in the last few years, is we seem to be living in the generation which is the fruit of the positive parenting movement now. In other words, kids that were raised in positive parenting are now people who are running our institutions, and there are dummy spits going on all over the place. So when we give our kids an award for just turning up, when we praise them for something that's not praiseworthy, we need to ask the question, has positive parenting worked, or have I misunderstood the whole notion of it? And just seeing the result in the American election and seeing a lot of the Democratic the dummy and chucking a stuzzy because they didn't win, I just wonder where we're going to go with that. And the question I want to ask is, has positive parenting failed, or have we misconstrued the whole thing?
I had a conversation with a family yesterday morning, and the question I threw out, it's a child who's just joined our school, having had a couple of really unsuccessful years, and we talked about different things, and I said, it feels like it's all for him. And I said something that my mother said to me every day when I came home from school was, what your school a better place today? And I said, I've raised my children like that. I said, when you ask him, what does he say to that? And they never even considered the question. And so it's really, it's changing the focus. I'm going to give you a little example where we set the bar on awards. So we do a spelling test every week, 40 words. At the end of a term, you've done somewhere probably in the vicinity of 300 words. To get an award, you cannot get an award if you've dropped more than 2. So we're setting the benchmark at like 99.7. Yeah.
Can I toss something in? In one of the parents' talked about gentle parenting, and they drew the parallel with positive parenting. And I'm not I don't know a lot about the whole detail of these two approaches, but one of them said immediately, I think the issue, and obviously there's, is that we've got to know why we're doing this, and that all good parenting comes back to one graph. So listen, one graph, high on affection and high on expectation, and that you need to be high on both. If you're just high on affection, then the problem is your kids are not life ready. If you're high on expectations, you'll drive your kids away and they won't bring their friends home when they're teenagers. High on both.
Can I just say there's a great book written on this, Abigail Shrier, Bad Therapy. Abigail Shrier, Bad Therapy, and she looks at a couple of chapters and a whole bunch of other things, gentle parenting, positive parenting, as opposed to traditional authoritative parenting. So that's a very good book, Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier.
And it just so happens we have, no, we don't have Abigail here today. I thought she was going to come. Thank you.
A very, very brief time. The moment you sanctify feelings, you open the gate to a definition of hate speech as anything, however true or right and good, violates that person's feelings.
Yeah, right on. Just as we're doing that, we've still got a few minutes. We started late today, so we've decided to make the mathematical decision of going a little bit further, but there's so many fantastic questions out there, we certainly didn't want to leave them. So we've got about another 7 minutes actually to do that, so there'll be more questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Another question. So thank you all for your talks. The comment is, I've first of all heard this yesterday in my Bible study. St. Augustine of Hippo in about 400 AD said that hope has 2 beautiful daughters. One is anger, to be angry about what's happened, and two is I've forgotten now. Hope and, so I've just had a mental block. Hope and courage to make sure things change. We talked about courage this morning and appreciate that. Second thought about education. What do we need from education? My thought, which may be quite simple and wrong, is that it depends on our worldview. So we either have, in my opinion, a Christian worldview or otherwise. So the 12-year-old in Pakistan needed to earn money for the family. And to a Christ-based education, we may do better. So thoughts and comments about that, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, I mentioned these forums I've had where a lot of parents and teachers are starting their own schools. A lot of them are Christian-based, and that's understandable. In the book, I mentioned Defend the West. Anna Crone talks about the importance of Judeo-Christianity. It's impossible to acknowledge Western culture without understanding that. Now, whether it's our political system, our legal system, two of the we all should read at some stage are Blackstone's Laws of England and the King James Bible. And thank God both arrived with the First Fleet. So in 1788, even though the French arrived in Botany Bay a week later, it was Philip who got to Sydney, raise the flag and salute the king. But those two books, so our culture is different to Chinese culture, different to Eskimo culture, different to Aboriginal culture. And one of the things I quote in the book is that in the national curriculum there are literally hundreds of references to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, history, even algebra and mathematics, which we haven't spoken about. Forget those old dead white males, those old Greek guys. There is Aboriginal geometry apparently, but it's that culture underpinned by Judaism. But at the same time, there are a lot of people, and this is where I did the postgraduate work, looking at a liberal education, which is not always as religious, put it that way, that there is the ability to, and whether it goes back to the idea of reason, of empiricism, of being able to be articulate and to seek truth. It doesn't always go back to Christianity. I think it should, but it doesn't always, because one of the things I'm trying to do with this school movement is broader, that it's not just happy clappers, as we call them in Australia, and I don't mean to disparage anyone, but there is a very strong anti-religious sentiment in the Australian character, happy clappers, as they call them. So, or God botherers. So it's a broader thing, and that's why when I talk about, not that I'm an expert in natural law, it actually goes back, I think, to Aristotle. And there's the virtues as well that go back, as was mentioned, to the Greeks. So it's a very broad church, put it that way.
Only that I think, foundational to education, which at the end of the day is about character development. I mean, we've always made a distinction between education and training. They're very different things. And an education is ultimately about character development and what kind of character we want to develop in children to become adults. And I don't know that you can answer that apart from the prior question, and it's been mentioned earlier. Well, what are we as human beings what are we for? What are we and what are we for? And that leads me to think that, and I'll stop here, that we probably want to start talking about not just a natural order, but a creational order. A creational order that we as human beings are a part of, and guide the way we think about ourselves and how we raise children into adulthood.
I started asking the question, what is freedom for? You may be familiar with John Paul's understanding of freedom, that freedom exists for the sake of love. Freedom exists so that we can make choices to love others. And I think we've completely forgotten that in this world.
Just quickly, the other one, I keep saying that, freedom from and freedom to. Bruno Bettelheim talks a lot about this, the American, I think, psychologist who survived Auschwitz, I think one of the concentration camps. the 60s, school education has been very much dominated by freedom to be creative, freedom to think whatever you like, freedom to. But to be able to do that, you need to know to that all the time. And Bruna talks about the subjects, which goes back to Greece and Rome. But it's a very important distinction for parents: freedom from and freedom to.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. We've just got time. Thank you for all the questions we've got, and well questions as well. We've just got time for one more question from over here. Thanks.
Hello. I could go on for hours talking about this, but one case has come to mind of an adult who, once when she was a child, was very insecure. She expressed herself and the freedom to have self-expression, and she has turned out to be the kind of complete woke human being. Her refusal to fit into what was accepted and her refusal to kind of embark on the standard direction has led her to a life of turmoil and destruction in her family, in her world, because she had this belief that she had a right to express herself her way. Now, I'd like to highlight that living authentically is something to be respected, but there's a difference here. And I don't know where she got that. I don't know any other kids that were raised to believe that they were entitled to express themselves as against being a good person.
Yeah, thanks. Stephen, did you want to jump in? And then...
Where did she get it from? It's everywhere. Watch Walt Disney, any movie directed towards children. It is all about self-expression, authenticity, being yourself, bucking against any authorities. Children's cartoons have gone from exploring, and children's entertainment has gone from exploring virtues to self-exploration, self-authenticity. No one can tell me I can't do this. And also, quite frankly, to just children being entertained by other children's on screens being little smartasses. So where did she get this? Just all through culture today.
I'm going to take a different, not going to blame the world. I'm actually going to turn the focus inward. So we have a parents' afternoon tea at school, and this story is going back about a decade. And at the afternoon tea, often quite come and have a chat. So there's this family that actually had got a place for a little boy who was going to be starting a few months later. And at the adult afternoon tea, I watched him go around and slap every adult there on the back. And I watched his mother watch him do it. And later, I didn't want to say it in front of her, second or third time we're having a chat, I said, I saw him doing that, and I saw you watching him doing that. Why didn't you jump in? Which is almost your... And she said, I don't want to curtail his spirit. And I said back to her, if you don't have behaviour, he's not going to have any friends, and that will definitely curtail his spirit. And so really what my point is taking a different tack. I'm not going to blame common culture. And I've changed in this. Years ago when my children were little, you go to a party and some of your friends' children are actually really poorly behaved. So most of us just stop going. We stop inviting those kids. I actually said, I've got to speak up. I've got to actually say it. So in that poor young woman's journey, how many people said to a mother and father, actually, that's a poor way of parenting? And so I think we can all jump in. We can blame Disney, but we could also all just jump in.
Yeah, thank you. Everyone for staying around for the time. I know it's gone a bit longer. We started a bit later. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all. If you could put your hands together.
For further information on ASF, go to www.scienceandfreedom.org.